And I think we're live for the first time at the Center Film Festival 2021. We're so happy to have everybody who's joining us join us. Even for those who didn't realize they were joining us because they're on Facebook and now they see us. This is part of the hybrid film festival this year. We want to give people an in-person experience if they're comfortable, and also an online experience if they're not local, and or if they're more comfortable watching films online and interacting with filmmakers online. So that is what we're doing this year. This is our very first one that actually went live. We just spoke with the filmmakers of the What Lies Beneath block. We're going to upload that for you later today. And in a couple of minutes, I will introduce our filmmakers and researchers who are doing really important work in reproductive rights through storytelling and filmmaking, and in our facilitator's case in research and writing reports and books about it. So my name is Pearl Gluck, and I'm the artistic director of the Center Film Festival, and we are just so happy to have all of you here. We're waiting for Erika Cohn to join us from Belly of the Beast. And I believe we have one more minute before actual showtime. What I can do is start to introduce our people that are going to be on the panel, and I'll just reintroduce them once Erika comes back in, because she'll want to meet them. So without further ado, this is a block that we have put together in order to have a conversation about reproductive rights for women worldwide, globally. But both of these stories look at specific situations in the United States. And as you now know, because you've seen the films, and if you haven't, you will, one film is about the right to have an abortion, and the other is about forced sterilization. So we're looking at the body as politics, and who is manipulating that conversation, what is happening behind the scenes, and what is the role of a filmmaker to be able to lift a camera, to be able to frame a story, and how can change be made through filmmaking. So I'm going to start by introducing the facilitator today, and that's Dr. Susanne Klausen, who's actually new here to the Penn State area. You came from Canada, is that right?
Yep.
Yep, she's here from Canada to join us. I just discovered that Suzanne's here because of this panel, and so I'm so happy to meet you here. Her work is about the politics of fertility, women's reproductive rights, and it specifically looks at South Africa and obviously other cases globally. You'll hear a little bit more about that today. And we also have with us one of the three filmmakers who made Abortion Hotline. This is Lisa. And that is Barbara Attie, who is from Pennsylvania, or at least was educated at Temple. The film itself is a Pennsylvania film. In this festival, we try and honor and highlight films that are made in Pennsylvania, and this is one of them. So our jury, who's now deliberating, when they look at different awards that they can give, one of them is a Made in Pennsylvania award. Barbara, we are so happy to have you here. Maybe you can tell us also a little bit about Janet and Michael, who worked with you on this film. It's a 3-person directing team. And Suzanne, thank you for being here as well. So I'm just going to kind of head toward the background a little. I'll jump in when we start having audience questions. You guys can ask questions in Facebook Live or on YouTube or in Eventive, and we're going to ask them for you. So just write them in chat. So without further ado, this is the panel discussion for Belly of the Beast. Hopefully Erika will join us soon. And Abortion Hotline, this is Lisa.
All right. Well, I'd like to start by thanking you, Pearl, for inviting me to facilitate this panel. It's an absolute thrill to meet the filmmakers of these two very powerful films, which I've seen both twice now, and was saying earlier that I'm so upset. And actually, rage has always fueled my research in this area. So I wonder, that's one of my questions, if that's something you relate to, Barbara. I'm a historian. As Pearl mentioned, I actually work in South Africa, and these issues are absolutely global. And I work on history of abortion, eugenics, and population control in the South African context. And during the course of my career, I have made a shift from working on reproductive rights to working on reproductive justice. And I've noticed both filmmakers use that term in discussing their work and in advertising their work. And just for those of you who aren't yet familiar with this shift, I'll just briefly tell you that reproductive justice has actually moved beyond the fight for rights. It's moved towards contextualizing individuals' ability to control their reproductive capacity. So in fact, it merges reproductive rights with social justice. And if you focus on a reproductive justice approach, then it necessarily brings in structural barriers like racism, classism, and so on for folks trying to access, maintain those reproductive rights. And the four rights that are laid out by Sister Song, an American group that essentially defined this term and this movement in the 1990s. Sister Song says that reproductive justice fights for the right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent our children in safe and sustainable communities. And these two films today touch on all four aspects of the reproductive justice movement in obvious ways. The first film is, as we heard, about abortion, and the second on population control, basically the modern version of eugenics. And so I think I'll just start and hope, that we're joined by the filmmaker of Belly of the Beast. But Barbara, your film on abortion, it focuses on the impact of the Hyde Amendment passed in 1976 that bars here in the United States the use of federal funds to pay for abortions, which of course hurts women on Medicaid, primarily women of color, poor women, obviously. And this offensive, misogynistic law has been on the books in your country for basically 45 years. So my first question when I was watching it is, why now? What motivated you to make this film 2019, decades into this struggle? And I guess my second question I'll just throw out there right away is why? What are you hoping to achieve with this film? Is it actually to try to change the law, or is it just you felt this need to bear witness, and you privilege these women's voices, which is so powerful? And so, just wondering why now and why in general?
Hi, Susanne. Hi, Pearl. And hi, Erika. And thank you for asking me to join you this afternoon for this conversation. Janet, Mike, and I actually started making this film in 2016. We conceived it in 2016 after the election of Trump, when Janet and I thought we had just finished a 90-minute biography of an African-American poet, and we thought it was time for us to take a break. And then Trump was elected, and we felt that a situation for poor women was going to get even worse under his presidency, and it has. But Janet and I have a long history of making films on reproductive rights issues. We made our first film together 30 years ago about the children of mothers who died when abortion was illegal. Who needed to find a way to terminate their pregnancies and died from those attempts. So Janet and I have a long history of making films on these issues. We've done many. Mike is my son, who teaches film at University of the Arts now. And he was 11 when we made our first film. It's called Motherless. So he grew up in a household with a deep commitment to this issue. So we were looking for a story that hadn't been told. There have been films on trap laws, on personhood issues, but we felt that the issue of access to abortion was a story that hadn't been told, and that even people who supported a person's right to get an abortion weren't aware of how difficult it was to access that right. And if you were poor, and it was made even harder by the Hyde Amendment. And we discovered that many people just didn't understand what the Hyde Amendment was. And this was a few years ago, and now the Hyde Amendment is more in the news, and I think more people are aware of it. But as you said, Susanne, it actually prevents federal funds from being used to pay for an abortion. So that affects people on Medicaid who are predominantly poor and women of color. And that affects women in 34 states and the District of Columbia. It affects people in the Peace Corps, in the military, who work for their government. Anybody who gets their health insurance from the government cannot use it to pay for an abortion. And so what that means is that a person has to, finds that they're pregnant and needs to raise anywhere from $350 to several $1,000s to pay for a procedure, and finds that their health insurance does not pay for it. And how do they raise that money? And that's what we looked at. And I think you may have asked me some other questions in that, but is there something else you'd want me to answer about that? That's what motivated us to make the film.
Yeah. I would love it if your next film could be on basically the global version of the Hyde Amendment, which is the global gag order that Reagan put in place in 1984, which bars federal funds being used to support abortion access and services and referrals, counseling, all of it, internationally. And that really impacts on where I work, in Africa. The same thing, right? It's really penalizing and pushing women back into unsafe abortions. So that was actually my follow-up question with this work you're doing and sort of exposing what the effects of the Hyde Amendment. Are you finding still sort of underground clandestine abortion networks, unsafe abortion? Is this something that became visible during the course of your work on this film?
Well, what we found was that approximately 1 in 4 women in the United States who want to have an abortion are not able to raise the funds and end up carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term. So that's, when you think about how many women are pregnant each year, that is a huge number. There is help for women out there, and that's what we were trying to highlight, that there are abortion funds. There were maybe 70 when we started making the film a few years ago, and now I think there are approximately 90 that actually try to help women, not just with the cost of the procedure, but there are a lot of other costs involved: transportation, housing. Now in Texas, if you live in Texas, you may have to travel thousands of miles out of the state to get an abortion. Childcare, hotels. There's a whole lot of additional costs, and there are abortion funds out there that can help women. So we wanted to highlight that by highlighting one fund in Philadelphia that does that work. Although they don't meet the entire cost of, as you can see in the film, they never meet the entire cost of the procedure, but try to help as much as they can. So we were trying to highlight that. But yeah, women will continue to get unsafe abortions or try to, self-abort because they can't afford the price of a legal procedure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I see Erika Cohn has joined us. Hello, Erika, director of Belly of the Beast, a phenomenal documentary. I was saying just before you joined us, I've watched it twice today. It's incredible. I'm a historian, and your film is really showing kind of the latest chapter, if you like, of reproductive violence being performed on Black women's bodies, in this case, the California prison system. There's so much to say about your film. Beginning from a filmmaker's perspective, though, the question that really just leapt to my mind was access to the women in prison. How on earth did you get the cameras in as often as you did, or was it just one trip that was very comprehensively filmed? I mean, I'm just shocked that the prison system allowed you in with cameras, or was it surreptitious? If you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And this is one of the second or third Q&A we've done together, Barbara. So really excited to be in conversation again with these two beautiful films. So I started this film in 2010 after being introduced to attorney Cynthia Chandler, who's featured in the film, through a mutual friend. And I was incredibly inspired by Cynthia's compassionate release work. She was the first attorney in California to get someone out of prison under compassionate release. and was also kind of blown away by the organization that she had co-founded, Justice Now, that you see in the film, which was the only organization in the country that had board members who were currently incarcerated, informing strategy and informing policy from the inside out, as opposed to the outside in, which is how so many organizations in the prison, kind of reform prison abolition space work. And they had a particular campaign called the Let Our Families Have a Future campaign, which essentially exposed the multiple ways that prisons destroy the basic fundamental human right to family. One of the most heinous, of course, being the illegal sterilizations, primarily targeting women of color. And immediately, to me, that screamed eugenics. You know, as a Jewish woman, the phrase "never again" was always in the back of my mind. And when I learned about this different kind of genocide that was happening through imprisonment, more generally speaking, and more specifically through forced sterilizations behind bars, I knew that I wanted to get involved some way, somehow. And initially, that was as a volunteer. Cynthia invited me into the organization, where I started off kind of creating campaign videos describing how the prison industrial complex functions as a form of eugenics, and then became a volunteer legal advocate, providing direct services for over 150 people inside California's women's prisons. And from that work, in collaboration with folks inside, began a project that would ultimately become Belly of the Beast. And kind of in the initial inception of this idea, it was really to chronicle the incredible human rights documentation work that was happening peer-to-peer in prison, and how that information was funneled out through this underground network of activists. Because of course, the prison didn't want this information getting exposed. And that kind of initial idea changed when I had the opportunity to meet Kelly Dillon, our main protagonist in the film, who is an incredible activist and community interventionist, and was sterilized at the age of 24 while undergoing a routine procedure while she was incarcerated at the world's largest women's prison, which is the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, in Chowchilla. And when I met her, at the time, she was working as a gang interventionist and domestic violence prevention counselor in Los Angeles. And when I approached her about this film, she wasn't interested in telling her story, but was very interested in being a part of the storytelling process. So she became a creative advisor kind of behind the scenes. And we really talked about how to create this visual landscape that does exactly what you're saying, that places audiences in these visceral, uncomfortable, vulnerable spaces that ultimately begs the question, is informed consent within these coercive environments even possible?
Yeah.
And so we didn't have access to some of those spaces. And so we actually carefully chose to reconstruct those moments. And we can talk more in depth about that process from a filmmaking kind of perspective of everything it took to get to that point and how to create this environment and shoot it actually like a fiction film. Then I will say, Kelly's role did change in the film, as you ultimately see in 2013 after the Center for Investigative Reporting's work reporting on the tubal ligations that were happening in California's women's prisons was published. All of a sudden, there was this tremendous attention, national conversation, potential for legislation. And that was the moment that Kelly really got called back in. The movement needed her to testify on behalf of so many other people who would otherwise be unable to testify. And that was the moment that Kelly and I decided that we would start filming her leading up to her testimony. And then the more and more we filmed, the more abundantly clear it became to both Kelly and me and everyone involved that the film really needed to center around her story and her relationship with Cynthia Chandler, having been the catalyst in the first place to begin investigating not only what happened to her, but others, and not only advocating for herself, but others to get to the point that we are today. And I think if it wasn't for Kelly in the first place, we wouldn't even be here having this conversation.
Wow, that is phenomenal. So those scenes are actually recreated. I'm very impressed. I truly believed it was documentary film, as in, you were there. So that's okay. That's very remarkable. What about, I'm just curious, the flip side of the forced sterilization of women, the mass incarceration of Black men in the United States is also a form of population control, right? Have you thought about doing the kind of the flip side of it, or look at that aspect of it, the locking up of Black men?
Yeah, it was really interesting. There was a quote by the Kenosha sheriff that kind of went. It was published, I believe it was last fall, where he specifically talked about locking Black men up as a form of keeping them from having children, and that was one of the most overt examples of eugenics, using imprisonment as a form of eugenics, and furthermore as a form of genocide to keep certain populations from being able to have children. And I think even, zooming out even further, when we talk about the incarceration of birthing individuals, when you lock them up for their reproductive capacity years with increasingly long sentences, that also functions as another form of population control. So reproductive oppression and mass incarceration go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. I hope you make that next film and sort of, as you say, step back and even give a bigger picture of this form of population control. I think I heard Angela Davis talk about this about 20 years ago, that it is a form of population control, the mass incarceration. In terms of the impact of your film, I wasn't surprised, but I was saddened to see the effect on the women still locked up. It seems there's some retaliation going on. I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about that, but I was wondering if nationally, if your film has been a sort of a catalyst for other movements in other states to expose and fight back at no doubt the same crimes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, since the film has come out, we actually have amazing news. I don't know if any of you have heard, but reparations for sterilization survivors has passed in California. That was always a tremendous, deep impact goal of ours. And so, as all of you know, Black and Indigenous, Latinx, incarcerated people, people with disabilities, people living in poverty have always been disproportionately targeted for sterilizations. And this kind of victory in California is a very critical step in confronting California's shameful eugenics history. As you learn in the film, California sterilized over 20,000 people historically. This kind of step forward with reparations ensures accountability and takes a bold stand against these kind of racist, ableist, sexist practices that continue to perpetuate health inequities to this day. And so California is now the first state to provide notification of coerced sterilizations. And I think it's important to note that the notification part of this is incredibly essential because people still to this day don't know that they were sterilized.
Yes.
There's no way that people in prison have access to their medical records like we in the free world do, even though it is a basic human right and they should have access to this. They are legally obligated to have access, but they don't. And so, as you see in the film, the process that Kelly goes through to try and obtain her medical records and find out what happened to her, and doctors are blatantly lying to her throughout the entire process. This kind of component of the reparations movement ensures that people will be notified. California is also the third state to provide monetary compensation to those who were sterilized in the historic eugenics programs, following in the footsteps of North Carolina and Virginia. So our film really helped create the political will for this to pass. And I hope that it creates a ripple effect throughout other states. I think it's time for other states to follow. And as we, saw recently last year in the immigration detention center in Georgia, like this is not something of the past. This is going on right now, that, involuntary sterilizations never stopped in the United States. It's not, something that we can shove under a rug or, forget about. It's actually happening during this time now as we're speaking, and through our kind of investigative reporting process in conjunction with the film, we sent Freedom of Information Act requests to dozens of states across the country and found that at least 8 other states are still performing sterilizations. So the work is not done.
No, and I also would like for our audience to also have, again, a bit of a global picture. You probably don't know this, Erika, but I work in South Africa, and I'm Canadian, and both those countries have histories of forced sterilization. Canada has a very similar story. It has a kind of a Kelly story. In Canada, it was Leilani Muir, who about 20 years ago began the process. In Canada, two of our provinces had eugenics laws for sterilization, British Columbia, where I'm from, and Alberta. And Leilani Muir was in some kind of reformatory when she was a young teen, and was told she was getting her appendix out and didn't know anything about what had really happened. And then years later, when she was married and she and her husband were trying to become pregnant and couldn't, finally went to the doctor and learned that her fallopian tubes had been tied. And she led the way with the class action suit for Canada to apologize and pay reparations. South Africa has had a much more recent case of this. Black women who are HIV positive have been forcibly sterilized. I'm sure you know this story as well. So this is a global attack on, women of color, poor women. Leilani Muir's white, but comes from a working class family, again, very vulnerable. So I think your film is going to, it's so powerful and it's so moving that I think it's going to have not just national implications, but I think will be drawn on internationally as well. So congratulations on your film, absolutely. Do you have plans to carry on filming in this area on this topic? I'm just curious. I've already given you an idea for your next project, but you probably already have a few things on the go. Can you share anything about what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I just released a short film called What You'll Remember that was in conjunction with the New York Times Op Docs this summer. And the film follows a young family who, after 15 years of struggling with housing instability and living in their car, secure an apartment in San Francisco on the eve of the pandemic. And it's this beautiful kind of love poem to the two parents to their 4 children about the meaning of home and family and security. And I am in the process of adapting that into a fiction screenplay. So that is what will be next. But issues of mass incarceration are very near and dear to my heart, and will definitely be continuing in this space as well.
Okay. Pearl, did you have any questions from the audience that we should pitch to the filmmakers?
Not from the audience, but I was wondering also, maybe all 3 of you can talk a little bit. First of all, welcome, Erika. It's so nice to see you. Welcome to the Center Film Festival. I'm also happy to hear that you've both been in a conversation like this before. I think Barbara told me that earlier. And when the 2 films came into the festival, I think through Film Fatale, right, which is an organization that supports women directors or female directors of films. When I saw these 2 films, it just made so much sense to me, as I said earlier, to have these 2 speak to each other, which Susanne is helping us navigate through. Barbara, maybe you could say a few words about how you came to this and if it's leading to another project for you as well. Both of the filmmakers we have here today are award-winning filmmakers, whether it's the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, whether it's the Emmys or the Peabodys. These are storytellers and arbiters of the world around them. That makes us wonder, first of all, where you're coming from and how you came to it, which of course you just told us, Erika, but also what you're seeing next. And Erika, you just shared that with us as well. So Barbara, maybe you can say a couple words about that too.
Okay, before I do that, I saw the Emmy in the background behind Erika, and she just won an Emmy for Outstanding Documentary for Belly of the Beast. So I want to congratulate you,
Okay.
Erika. That's really, it's quite a coup. That's wonderful and so deserved. So I think I mentioned that Janet and I have had a long commitment to reproductive justice issues going back to, well, before we were filmmakers. We think of ourselves not just as filmmakers, but of activists. I've been on the board of Planned Parenthood. Janet has volunteered for many abortion rights organizations. And that's actually how we came to our film, that she had been on the board of the Women's Medical Fund. And as part of her training, she listened to the calls that were coming in from people who didn't have the money to pay for their abortions. And that's how we decided to make this film, is that she was so familiar with the story. And then Mike and I went in and listened to the calls. And because Jen and I have been so present in the community for so many years, there's a trust there. So the Women's Medical Fund believed that we could do justice to this story. And what we really wanted to do was to humanize the people behind the figures, that they're not just data points, but these are human beings who have, so many, issues that they're dealing with, whether it's having children that they're trying to raise, or low income jobs, or no jobs, or unsupportive partners, or medical issues. We were just, trying to have the audience see that these are human beings who really need help. So we have been trying to push this film to advocacy organizations. And also we were really excited. We had a screening for the pro-choice caucus in the House of Representatives, because for the first time a few months ago, a budget was proposed for without the Hyde Amendment in it. I don't think the budget's is going to be passed without the Hyde Amendment, but this was the first time in 45 years that Congress was willing to that the majority party was actually willing to submit a budget that didn't have Hyde in it. So a small step to trying to get rid of Hyde and to get health insurance, federal health insurance, to pay for this procedure for an abortion. Pearl, was there something else that you asked me in there too?
I mean,
what I missed?
I was going to say, the third film that I would have put in this group, but it would have been a 3-hour block, is My So-Called Selfish Life, which is a feature doc about the pressure on, women specifically, obviously, to be mothers, but even the kind of straightness of it, or the expectation of it. And I felt like this would be really interesting to hear all three of you talk about. And that's why we call this blog Body Politics. I mean, what is it, with your insider knowledge? You've spent so much time in 2 of your cases behind the camera and meeting people and talking to them. And one of you as a writer and a researcher, what makes, in your mind, I mean, other than throwing our hands up and saying, women are always in the center of this violence and this war on our bodies. What are you seeing, and what are ways in which you feel that this has become a place for this kind of conversation, who should or shouldn't have children, who can and cannot make decisions in such a way? We would love to hear from the 3 of you about that. You're coming from 3 very different places, both of you as filmmakers, but still different points of view.
Well, one of the things I love about this pairing is it's all about bodily autonomy. And, if, when, how to have a family. And so these films, oftentimes it's like these 2 issues become separate. The sterilization issue doesn't actually relate to, choices surrounding abortion. And to me, it's all one and the same. It's all comes down to bodily autonomy, the right to decide how, when, if to have a family, and, also decisions over one's reproductive autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue of control over one's own body, I mean, the hypocrisy of people who want to restrict that has really come to the fore over the argument over vaccine mandates. Because on the one hand, people say, I don't want anyone to tell me that I have to take a vaccine, but on the other hand, you can't do what you want with your body. Which way do you want to, do you want to think about this? They're just so contradictory. So it really is about, I feel like, the right trying to control what people do.
Yeah, for me, I call my area fertility politics because it's broad enough to encompass everything. I started off looking at history of eugenics, so it's basically I'm always interested in about societal debates and struggles regarding who should have children and who shouldn't, and who gets to decide. Those kind of debates and discourses, brings out issues of class and race and so on. But I have to say, for me, it's first and foremost a feminist issue. In Canada, in the 80s, we had a national battle to keep abortion out of the criminal code. We had our Supreme Court strike down our abortion law in the 80s, and a national movement erupted to basically keep it out of the criminal code. And it's a very interesting story worthy of a documentary, but long story short, we won. So in Canada, we don't even have an abortion law. It is strictly considered a medical procedure. So I have to say, watching your film, Barbara, I felt such anger that those women even had to answer those questions. I mean, I completely understand why the organization is needing to ask, because funds are limited and there's this need to prioritize. Some women's lives are at risk now and need those abortions. But to me, it's just so offensive that any woman should even have to say, yes, she has a job, no, she doesn't, and so on. I mean, I don't want to romanticize Canada too much. We have access issues, which is what you are talking about. In Canada, we don't have any laws about abortion, but rural women from the north also have issues around transportation and getting to clinics. And there's also not necessarily great treatment of women in some particular hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, this is just a fundamental feminist issue, fighting against kind of heteropatriarchal demands, expectations, pressures, and laws.
Yeah, I know it's interesting that you mentioned the questions that are asked to the callers at the to the fund, because that is controversial. What is the right way to actually be able to offer help, and to be able to, to make stretch your resources so it can help as many people as possible. And so asking all those questions is controversial, and the organization has discussed the right way to do it. And there are, as I think I mentioned earlier, there are approximately 90 abortion funds in the United States that help people pay for their procedures, and they have different ways of doing it. So we were, I think we weren't saying that this is the right way to do it, to ask those questions, but this is how this fund has chosen to do it. And we always found it interesting that we knew that unlike the callers who didn't know how much money they were going to be able to get, we knew that, the audience is, party to the fact that they're not going to be able to get everything that they need, that they're going to have to come up with some of it themselves, no matter how hard that is. So we found that like an interesting dynamic there.
Is that also a principle, like a policy, not to give the full amount? Or I was interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think very rarely they give the full amount, because for somebody who needs, like the last caller in the film, who had a fetal anomaly and needed a very late term abortion, which was going to cost thousands of dollars. I think in that case, the organization, the fund, will actually put together money from various sources to try to meet that need. But in general, they're trying to help as many people as they can and stretch their resources as far as they can. And so that means not being able to pay everything that it's going to take. And so that's why they go through, can your mother help you? Do you have any friends that can help you? Go try to problem solve with the callers on how they're going to raise money.
It wasn't clear to me how they prioritize, which reasons do they privilege over other reasons for getting the money. I mean, again, I found it all cringe-inducing that these women had to answer anything. If you need an abortion, you need an abortion, end of story. But did you talk to them at all about that? Like, what trumps what in terms of getting their limited funds?
I think their goal is to make sure that the callers actually get their procedure. So, if, somebody might come to them like, the day after their call and say, I just can't come up with that money. And then they might try to find an additional $50 or $75. So the goal is to make sure that everybody who calls them gets that procedure, although it's not always evident there from the calls. But all those people who did call, which is not revealed in the film, but they all got their procedures, and that is the goal. And they do whatever they have to do, but that generally means not being able to completely fund the need for each
And well, having
person.
said what I said, I just want to end by saying their work's phenomenal. I mean, I understand limited funds and so on there, and it shouldn't even be necessary. This is the Hyde Amendment, which is what your film's about. That's the crime that's really being committed here, this federal law that you have.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the organization's amazing. I just wanted to put that on the record. So.
I think we have time for one last question. The time really does fly. We have a very large student audience, and I think one of the strengths of there's so many, but one of the strengths of both of these films that really stands out is the ability to tell a really impactful and meaningful story without feeling lectured at, and really getting into the mind and the heart and the desire and the passion of one human being or more. And I think it would be really wonderful to hear from both of you. This isn't necessarily the how you got started question, but in your experience and very successful, or I should say accomplished storytelling skills, what are some early stages that you think would be helpful for a student audience to hear about, or even for people who are new to filmmaking, that you're looking for as you're directing a piece like this, clearly through your heart, clearly through your research, but also as a storyteller that truly needs to connect with passion and human connection? Either of you can start with this. And I think this will be the last question.
Barbara, do you want to start? I have dogs barking in the background.
In addition to your Emmy, you have dogs barking in the background.
So Pearl, do you want to know like how, like advice to young filmmakers on how to get started in a career of filmmaking, or how I personally went to film school. After I had 3 children, I had been an economics major in college. And
awesome.
and so I was like in my 30s and said, what do I really, after my kids all got into elementary school, I said, okay, what do I want to do with my life now? I said, oh, I think I'd like to be a filmmaker. What did I know about that? And so I went to Temple and got an MFA in film. And I have to say that for me personally, at the time, film school was, the right way, because equipment was not as accessible or inexpensive as it is today. I'm talking about like almost 40 years ago, when the cameras were big and heavy and expensive, and editing equipment was expensive. So I think it's like a whole different situation now, but I think it's like to be open to the world around you and to be curious. And I think if you're curious and open and you have a story to tell, I think it's a lot easier to do that today than it was 40 years ago when I first started.
And I want to remind the people that are listening, if you came in the middle, that she's not just talking the talk. Her own son has taken up filmmaking as well. So she's walking the walk too. Yeah, that wasn't exactly my question, but that was a great answer. But I think Erika's going to hit that one, which is, what touches you? Like, how do you know you're onto something? I don't want to ask too much of a specific question, but I think she knows what I'm going for. But that was awesome to hear. I love that you returned to school. I did the same. I think that's really inspiring. Thank you, Barbara.
So the first thing I do when there's a subject matter or a person or an idea that really grabs me is I write that down immediately. I write down how I feel about it. I write down any imagery that's associated with it, any kind of memories that in thinking about this topic, it kind of floods back into my head. It's a very like emotional, sensory it's called a précis, kind of detailed list of how I feel about that, because you will never, ever, ever have the fresh eyes that you get to experience in doing a project. The moment that I first walked into Justice Now was an incredibly emotional, incredibly like all sensory awareness, kind of blown out of the water experience. The moment that I met Judge Khulud, the subject of The Judge, my film before Belly of the Beast, the moment that I met her was this kind of larger than life moment. How do I convey, the moment that I walked into her courtroom and this like 3-dimensional experience that I was happening on a 2D screen? I write all of that down, and then I come back to those questions that I had when I initially was drawn to the subject matter, or why I wanted to do that project in the first place, because these films are hard. They take years. There is a ton of sacrifice. This is not a well-funded industry. There are so many challenges along the way, especially in making films that are social justice topics. So I think, come back to that. Right, first, number one, write it down. 2, come back to that when you're confused or tired or wondering how to tell something or how to keep going. You're exhausted. And 3, there's a reason that stories grab you by the throat and don't let go. There is a reason that we exist in this world as storytellers. I believe we're all storytellers, and that's how we communicate. That's how generations, have passed down like folklore and experiences. And we all have that innate ability within us. So find the story that grabs you by the throat and doesn't let go, and then never take no for an answer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that level of authenticity. And to me, Erika, it speaks to where you're headed next. We're trying to bring, you did a little of that in Belly of the Beast, but now really trying to bring what you've seen in the world around you and give it the authenticity in a fictionalized setting. We have a little more, control's the wrong word, but craft power, let's say, where you can decide what happens first, second, and third to recreate that initial attraction to a dynamic that's happening. And I think that's really inspiring. Thank you, both of you, for that insider knowledge. And I want to thank you, Susanne, for bringing your wisdom and your research. And if you can just close out the session for us and give us a sense of what is happening in your perspective and in your work, and ways in which people could potentially get involved in this level of activism around the autonomy of one's body, men, women, and everyone in between, or a combination thereof.
Okay, thank you, Pearl. I want to just end by saying both of these films grabbed me by the throat. I want to congratulate and thank both of you. They're phenomenal. I've developed a course I'll be teaching next term for the first time. It's called From Rights to Justice, a Global History of Reproductive Justice. And I'm going to assign both your films. I'm going to look at forced sterilization and the struggle for abortion. So both your movies are on my syllabus now. And I'm also starting here at Penn State, a Penn State Reproductive Justice Project that pairs Penn State with colleagues of mine in South Africa, because these struggles, as we started off this conversation, right, these are global struggles. And for students who may be listening that are interested in the issues our filmmakers raise today, please take my course, contact me. There's so many ways we can work locally. Incarceration, Indigenous issues as well is huge here. Reproductive health services on reservations in the United States. There's a lot we can do in our own backyard, but also I do work in South Africa. So I'm very interested in bringing a global South perspective to these, literally these life and death issues. So thank you so much, Barbara and Erika and Pearl, for inviting me.
Absolutely. I want to thank all three of you. Thank you, Susanne, for saying that actually a lot of the films that did come in for consideration were about those very subjects of incarceration, in addition to what we've talked about, and Indigenous peoples' heritage and current issues. So we do have films in the festival happening now on both of those subjects. Our opening night in Phillipsburg is a fiction film called Lorelei that looks at reintegration. We just had a conversation with the filmmaker from Since I've Been Down, which does look at the very thing you opened this whole conversation with, which was a question of what's happening, like body autonomy, in this case, Black male bodies and incarceration. And prison reform. So keep having these conversations. We encourage the arts for these kinds of conversations as much as it is important to do the legal work and the research and the boots on the ground. Thank you, all three of you, for being here with us. The live session will end. However, this whole conversation will live with this block of films. So you can hear this, and please do reach out to any of these three people on the panel. They're all reachable online through their websites. If you had any questions, good luck to all of you in your work. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
All right. I think Randy is the one who stops the recording. Are we still live? I think I have to actually leave you. This is going to be hard.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Okay. Bye. Lovely to meet
Bye.
all of you amazing women. Bye.
Thank you.
The awkward online space. Suzanne, thank you. Thanks,
Oh.
Barbara.
It was a pleasure. I'm going to try to be there at 5, Pearl.
Sweet. We'll see you in the in-person. Bye.